Okay, let's think more about the minimal group paradigm, and we'll of course be looking at this in laboratory class 2 as well. So one of the key ideas to emerge from this group of work, group of studies, is that people have a social identity and that they want to define their own groups positively. They want positive distinctiveness for their own group compared to other groups. And within social identity theory, this moves on to start to think more about, well, what happens for those groups that don't have a positive social identity? What happens for members of low status, disadvantaged groups within society? How do they achieve a positive social identity and positive distinctiveness? And so much of social identity theory is trying to answer this question within an understanding of intergroup relations. So in a social system, there are often low status and high status group members. What happens for members of the low status group? So how do they achieve a sense of positive distinctiveness? So one of the answers that social identity presents is that members of the low status group could try and become to be seen as members of the high status group. So that's referred to as individual mobility. So they try and pass or take on the characteristics of the high status group in the hope that they will be seen to be members of the high status group, and in that way they'll be able to achieve at least an individual positive identity. Another way that members of low status groups could achieve positive distinctiveness is to try and redefine the characteristics of their group such that they're seen to be positive and not negative. So an example could be African Americans starting to try and think about being Black not as being lazy but as being beautiful. So trying to redefine the characteristics of this group such that they are seen to be more positive versus negative, or to actually compare their own group to groups that are even lower status than they are. So downward social comparison. So they could think that they could achieve positive distinctiveness by thinking that they are actually better than some other groups that might exist within society. And they're referred to as social creativity strategies. The other thing that low status group members could do to achieve this positive distinctiveness is to start to challenge the high status group. So they could start to work together to bring about change such that they won't be low status anymore, that the actual conditions that they have as a group will be better. And they can do that through forms of social change by protest or trying to get new laws introduced or get sort of different treatment by authorities within the social system. And that is referred to as social competition. So if you are a member of a low status group, you're devalued in society, there are strategies to do with individual mobility, strategies to do with social creativity, and strategies to do with social competition. So then the question becomes, why would a low status group choose one strategy over the other? When do they choose individual mobility? When do they choose creativity? And when do they choose competition? And social identity theory went on to consider some other features of a social system that might lead to, which would shape which choice was made or likely to be made by members of the low status group. And these dimensions are legitimacy, stability, and permeability. And there's been quite a bit of research looking at these factors and the degree to which they will lead to one of these three different strategies. So legitimacy refers to whether members of the low status group and the high status group believe that the current relations between the groups is actually legitimate. And if members of the low status group believe it is legitimate, then they may be less likely to engage in social competition, for example. How stable do members of the low status group think the system is? How likely is it that efforts are going to lead to some kind of change? And also how permeable it is. How easy is it for you to move from being a low status disadvantaged group member within this system to being a high status group member? And of course, if the boundary is impermeable, it's not possible to move from one group to the other, then that would sort of rule out individual mobility and might encourage one of these other two strategies. So at this point in time, they're probably the key features of the theory that sort of are relevant. But social identity theory really is an analysis of intergroup relations and when groups in society are likely to engage in more cooperative or competitive ways of interacting. So if we look at some of the critiques of this social identity perspective as a way in which we understand prejudice, there is a strength where this is seen to be an intergroup theory that recognises that people can think of themselves as both individuals and group members, that much of the research has been conducted in the laboratory, and there's been sort of calls for more naturalistic research to test some of the core ideas in the theory. But in a way, you could also combine some of these insights from social identity into trying to make sense of Sharif's earlier work, which of course was very naturalistic. So when we combine these ideas together, they can help us sort of understand what might be going on in Sharif's studies. So when people showed cohesion, really, they're acting as an in-group, they're acting in a way where there is a shared social identity. When they are engaging in intergroup conflict, it's very much an us versus them situation where there is intergroup discrimination and competition over resources. And then towards the end, you could think of a more superordinate group being formed, which is where there's cooperation and there's kind of inclusive cohesion. So we've still got sort of a sense of two groups, but they've now joined to form one overarching group which has common goals. So the psychology that emerges from our understanding of social identity can help us understand these very rich, naturalistic kind of settings. And of course, when it comes to prejudice, the key idea here is when there's going to be intergroup competition and intergroup discrimination, and the role of social identity in helping us to explain that. And of course, where we get intergroup discrimination and intergroup conflict, they're instances where we're going to see prejudice. So if we were just going to think about how this theory helps us explain prejudice in the context of COVID-19, it does fit what we're seeing, the events that we're seeing at the moment. People are increasingly seeing the world in in-group and out-group terms, and so therefore they're more likely to show negative attitudes and discrimination towards out-group members, foreigners. So there is a nice fit between some of the ideas in social identity and the events that we're seeing now. You could ask, well, why are people seeing the world in more of an intergroup way? And I think it is, because of sort of fear and threat and concern from the outside in a way that makes people think more in-group, out-group terms. So we're going to leave this part of the lecture here and come back with a bit of a summary, and also to move on to thinking about what do we do about prejudice and prejudice reduction. Okay, see you soon.